Who am I?
Richard Casimir, media veteran.
Why I got in radio is because I'm good with a knife.
Contributor in Perth, Australia.
Our friend Richard Casimir in the United States.
How are you guys enjoying the 19th century? Is that working out for you? How can you say, I'm not making fun of you as a race, I'm making fun of you as black performers?
I think as a country, Americans are as patriotic as the most rabid UK football hooligan.
Who am I?
Richard S. Casimir. I actually have a sneaking suspicion that there might come a time when we will, in fact, give this guy Mission Impossible. I don't think it's happened yet. Richard Casimir, good morning.
Good morning. How are you, brother?
We're doing extremely well. Now, by the way, if you'd like to be this man's friend on Facebook, you can ask him to be your friend. Richard S. Casimir is where you'll find him. Casimir, by the way, is spelled K-A-Z-I-M-E-R, or should I say K-A-Z-I-M-E-R. See, I've covered both sides of the Pacific Ocean now. My friend, newspapers, one of those things which, let's face it, despite the passage of time, and I suppose despite the arrival of the electronic media in all its forms, because, of course, when newspapers first started, electronic media in any form, including wireless, didn't exist. But despite the passage of time and the changing of technology, the newspaper, to a large extent, even to this day in the computer age, still remains largely the same as it always has done. That is basically news printed on a piece of paper, of course, the information it contains, and the speed with which it gets that information has all gone much faster. But the issue is always centred around newspapers and the influence of newspapers. So, to start with, in the United States these days, how influential are newspapers considered to be?
Less than it used to be. A lot of the major papers will do editorials, and during political campaigns, they will endorse one candidate or another. The effectiveness of it is suspect. I really don't think that it has much sway whatsoever. Generally, if a newspaper, for example, has a sort of political leaning, whether it's left, right, or center, those readers are going to vote for the left, right, or center candidate anyway, so whether or not the newspaper endorses a particular candidate is kind of irrelevant.
So am I correct in saying that what you really believe is that a newspaper takes the position that its readers have already taken anyway, so all it's doing is reinforcing what its readers already believe?
Pretty much so. Sometimes there are surprises. Sometimes there may be a newspaper that is heavily conservative, and then they might go with a moderate Democrat, for example, and there'll be a surprise. But as far as the readers then going, you know what, I'm going to vote based on this editorial, no, I don't think that that happens.
Now, in your lifetime, do you think that the influence of newspapers has diminished, increased, or remained basically the same? And I guess to a large extent I'm looking for your own perception here, because I guess others may have different perceptions, but what's yours?
I think that it's diminished significantly, especially in the past decade or so. Circulation has dropped in the major newspapers for a lot of reasons. It's not cost effective to run a newspaper anymore. There's a steady drop in readership, escalating print in labor costs because we're now buying newsprint from overseas, mostly from trees that were cut over here. So a lot of our processing plants and paper mills are now shipped overseas. So it costs a lot of money to get that newsprint to come over here to print the U.S. newspaper. Ad revenue has dropped in large part due to the economy, but also because the 24/7 news cycle with the internet and cable news is putting newspapers out of business. There's an old newspaper saying that goes, anything after 9 a.m. is old news. And when you realize what time a newspaper absolutely positively has to go to press, which is in the wee hours of the morning, and then hit the streets at maybe 4 or 5 a.m., that by 9 o'clock, whatever story that they put to bed when they went to press, so much has changed globally in just a few short hours that credibility of that story is lost if something drastically changed. So it's really become an archaic form of media compared to what's out there and what we get on the internet.
Now, what about online? Because, of course, all the major newspapers have gone online and certainly are available online. How much is that changing the dynamics of a newspaper, especially since I don't know what the situation is in the United States, but there's more and more talk here about major newspapers charging for people to be able to access their sites online. The problem that they run into is that somebody might start a site that's free, so they're caught somewhere between the devil and the deep blue sea. Is the situation similar for you?
Absolutely. There are some major newspapers that offer an online edition. They'll offer it for free, but it has limited stories in it. If you want to get the full story or 100% of the content, you then have to go out and buy the newspaper. So that's kind of a teaser. There are other newspapers that will offer their complete version online, but for a subscription. There are some papers that actually offered the full online version and then for free, and then decided to start charging people. and then everybody who was reading it normally would then go and find the same information elsewhere. This is an ongoing issue because the cost of doing this, whether it's print and now even the cost of doing it online, newspapers are using fewer and fewer reporters to cut cost. So you're seeing basically the same stories in any medium, whether it's a subscription form or for free. Now we're seeing fewer local stories and more national stories, which has no bearing on your local communities.
I think something that we've seen over the years is that as different forms of medium and different forms of entertainment have come into play, what has been there or what is existing has to change because of the newbie that comes on the market. How are newspapers changing to respond to that? Because if nothing else, we can argue that when it comes to technology and when it comes to change, newspapers are truly the great survivors.
Well, what we're seeing is they're trying to do that symbiosis between the print and the internet. Now, there are some people out there that absolutely have to have the printed paper in front of them. There's still quite a few folks who would rather go to work every day with that newspaper or read it Sunday morning in their homes. It's more convenient. The hard copy newsprint has a longer shelf life than what's on the internet version of it because those stories are always changing, so they have to go away. They disappear. Whereas if you have, for example, a New York Times or a Boston Globe, which are a couple of the major newspapers, and you buy the Sunday edition of that, there's all sorts of great sections to it, and that you've got a shelf life of hopefully of an entire week. With the online edition, that news is there, and it's only there for perhaps 24 hours, and then it's gone, and then you have to research it in the archives. A lot of newspapers don't keep archives on the internet very long either. They're trying to find that good balance between the two, between the ink and paper and the internet. In all honesty, it's not succeeding. There are some papers that have shut down that have been around here for generations that are now either totally out of business or they've cut down their circulation and they're only being printed a few days a week as opposed to 7 days a week, or they are now completely internet versions. Honestly, I do see a time where the major newspapers are going to go the way of the dinosaur.
You really believe that? Now, what about issues like you talked about the fact that some of those papers, you mentioned the Sunday editions having lift-outs and features and all that sort of stuff. Something that we certainly see in our local papers here is there are features and lift-outs and there are definite distinctive features within a paper almost on a daily basis. Do you see more of that sort of thing and evidence of that sort of thing occurring in the US?
Well, it's been a regular mainstay for the newspapers. Certain days of the week, they had all the store coupons, especially the grocery store coupons. On Sunday, the edition, you would have the magazine section and the huge sports section and life and leisure and things like that. Those are important. If these newspapers that still provide that in an ink and paper format can still make a profit, good for them. That's something that hopefully will never go away. But those are few and far between, and it's not unusual to see a major market go from maybe 3 newspapers to 2 newspapers to only having 1 newspaper. And that's not necessarily a good thing when people want and need a kind of a broad selection of the same information.
Now what happens, and I can imagine that the straight argument there would be, well, they're getting that, now they're just getting it via the internet rather than printed newspapers. Would you agree with that?
Not necessarily, because you've got the same reporters, as I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, but if I could just interrupt you there for a moment, Richard, I guess one of the things you do get on the internet, even though sometimes you can argue some of the things that people put up there are absolutely off the wall, if nothing else, you really get diversity of opinion on the internet. People who, say, for example, would never, ever have had their opinions printed in a newspaper because nobody would have even thought about printing it, or in some cases even dared to print it, they will quite happily be able to publish it on the internet. So you could just about argue that in some particular instances you're getting a much wider diversified opinion on the internet than you could ever possibly get through newspapers.
That's a good point. Let's do an example here. Let's say the New York Times and the Huffington Post. The New York Times is considered one of the liberal bastions of print journalism in the United States, as is the Huffington Post on the internet. Now, the Huffington Post is solely an internet-based format. You can get far more, 10 times more information, 10 times more people who are writing about the same topic on the Huffington Post than you can in the New York Times. Are they any better than the New York Times? Some would say no, but you're absolutely correct where you get more of a variety of opinion on the internet from credible journalists.
You also get barking mad people with their opinion, but to me that's part of the joy of the internet. And actually it also for me is an education process, because I think one of the things is it teaches you is to look at something, to analyse it critically, and to say, is this being written by a person who's actually got their head screwed on right, or is this being written by somebody who's off the wall or fanatical or whatever the case may be? So in some respects, it probably serves also as an education as well as a wider, diversified source of information.
As long as the newspaper, in its printing of letters to the editor, which you only see once a week, as opposed to somebody commenting on a news story on a website, which is instantaneous. As long as there's some semblance of credibility of who's doing the publishing. But then again, who knows? Somebody who's worked in the trenches as a credible journalist for 20 or 30 years, then you've got their counterpart as a habitual blogger that now has stories printed on this internet website. They don't have a journalism degree. They haven't done their time in the trenches. You got to take everything with a grain.
Now, the other thing is, what about the area of government regulations of newspapers, or more specifically, I suppose, newspaper ownership? Is there any degree of control? I would imagine that it also falls under the Clayton and Sherman Acts, as many other industries do.
You're not required to be a U.S. citizen to own a newspaper.
You used to be, though, didn't you?
I don't believe so. You have to be a U.S. citizen to own television.
In terms of newspaper ownership, do you have any cross-media ownership regulations, like, for example, people owning newspapers not being able to own other parts of the media or anything like that?
Yes, there was a time back in the 1980s, the Federal Trade Commission and the Federal Communications Commission decided in their infinite wisdom that it wasn't fair for any media outlet to own a newspaper, radio station, and television station in the same market. So they had this regulation. So what happened was that most of these entities decided to sell off their radio stations because they knew that the value of the newspaper and television was much more than radio. So what they did was they broke up their conglomerates and they sold off the radio stations to a lot of mom and pop owners and minorities who quickly ran it into the ground. Some years later, the government decided that wasn't such a good thing, and now it's not unusual to see 5, 6, 10 radio stations in a single market owned by the same entity. So that kind of fell by the wayside. That doesn't really happen anymore. It does go back to when the strong survives and then the smaller media outlets, whether it's newspaper, television, or radio, fall by the wayside, and then you have one company that is now, this goes back to your original question about having a political agenda. That's everything that they put out there. The only regulation that we really have, and it's really not a regulation, it's a concern, is the protection of a journalist source, predominantly in newspaper.
That's also become controversial here, obviously from time to time, because something occurs where that becomes an issue. What is the position in the United States?
Depends on which way the political wind blows. The source's anonymity is no longer protected in cases of, let's say, grand jury testimony, national security, which now can encompass anything, or whatever mood a judge or a federal prosecutor has to be in at the time. If they want to know from a reporter where that person got the information and who they got that information from, and that reporter doesn't tell, they are no longer protected under any sort of constitution or quasi-constitution. So
don't they usually use the First Amendment as their defense in that regard?
They do, but in times of national security, that can be thrown out the window. I mean, we just went through 8 years of that being shredded by the Bush administration, and it's carried over into the Obama administration. Whistleblowers, for example, are no longer protected. Whistleblowers are usually the first people that end up standing trial and going to jail for reporting violations, especially government violations.
Well, actually, if it's any comfort to you, which I'm sure it's not, whistleblowers here have never had any protection, and usually if you decide to be a whistleblower in the public service, what you do is you blow the whistle and then accept that your career is also blown with the whistle.
Exactly. The American Civil Liberties Union, that's a major thorn in their side, is that there isn't any protection from protecting the anonymous source anymore. So that's basically it as far as government regulation or any government crackdown on journalists here in the United States. We'll see where that goes. I don't know. I think sometimes it's a good thing because if it's a court case, both sides have the right to know who their accusers are. The other thing happens is that there are so many leaks and so many holes in government and in judicial system that the lives of anonymous sources are not protected. And that's where you run into an issue if somebody gets popped during a grand jury testimony or a major case, and then you, the government or the defense, has no witness anymore. Yes. So It's a dicey issue.
Mind you, I noticed something that was passed last week that that they were talking about over here. Apparently, and it's been a suggestion that people like Australian publishers might be tempted to move their businesses and assets to the US as a result of a new law that shields US journalists and publishers from defamation from outside the country, which is actually interesting because what you're saying now is that the greatest threat perhaps comes from within. But apparently, there has been a new law that basically says that US journalists and publishers cannot be sued for defamation from outside the country.
Well, at the risk of sounding Orwellian, the greatest threat has always been from within over here.
Well, you're right. It does sound a bit Orwellian, but that's rather interesting. Isn't it interesting that there's a law that'll protect from outside, but what about from within?
I don't know how that's going to work. Anybody can sue anybody
Now, when you
on the planet if they have a good enough lawyer.
When you start to talk about stuff like that, and of course I suppose this also comes down to the new medium of the internet, it becomes harder and harder, doesn't it, to enforce some sort of law if it is published off-site. Let's say, for example, you have a journalist who has information that is leaked, say, for example, about some corruption within government. If you then go and publish that on an offshore website, it makes it much harder, doesn't it? I mean, how do you go and prosecute somebody who's actually outside your jurisdiction?
That's absolutely true. I mean, we have libel laws, defamation laws here. So that's that smoke in the bottle as far as the internet is concerned. Where does it come from? Where's the source? Where's the server? I think people are going to be protected, and even if they're saying something or printing something online within this country, and yet their server is in East Gishmalingi somewhere and across the continent.
Yes.
Does that protect them? That's just strange.
Yeah, I know. There's no doubt about that. My friend, as always, most interesting. Now, can I get something a little bit brave off you? The newspaper in the format that we presently have it, how long will it be before we see the demise of it in your view?
I hope never. I hope never. I love newspapers. I work for a newspaper. I hope we never see the demise of the print and ink newspaper, to be honest with you. There's just something about the smell, the comfort, the use of a paper newspaper. I hope it's more recycled than it used to be in years past to cut costs, but I hope that we never see the demise of it.
All right, well, thanks very much for that. Richard Kazmer, if you'd like to be his friend on Facebook, Richard S. Kazmer, Kazmer.